May Harper did not cry when they marked her file with a red X. She had cried enough. She stood at the edge of the placement yard with her satchel pressed against her ribs and her bad knee already stiffening in the morning cold, and she watched 23 women get chosen ahead of her like she wasn't standing right there. She was 31 years old, a widow, and according to the agency's newest clerk, a liability. What no one in that yard understood yet, not the clerk, not the laughing ranchers, not even the quiet man watching from the fence, was that May Harper had already saved 3 ranches that no one thought could be saved. And she was about to save one more. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow May's journey all the way to the end, and drop the name of your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The placement yard outside Callows Creek smelled like horse sweat and judgment. May Harper had stood in yards like this before Abilene, Tucson, a forgettable stretch of dust outside Flagstaff, and she had learned early that the first 30 seconds decided everything. Men came in with their minds already made up, scanning down the line the way they'd scan a row of fence posts, looking for height and steadiness, and no visible cracks. They didn't want to be surprised. Surprise meant risk, and risk on a working cattle ranch meant money. She was going to be a surprise whether she liked it or not. She kept her chin level and her breathing slow, her satchel gripped in both hands in front of her body. Her left knee had locked twice on the walk from the boarding house, the cold getting into the joint the way it always did when October dropped without warning. She'd had to stop twice behind the milliner's shop and press her palm flat against the building and breathe through her teeth until the joint released. Nobody had seen. She'd made sure of that. The line held 24 women. May had counted twice. She was standing at the far left end, which put her last in the natural order that men tended to walk left to right, beginning to end most promising down to least. She hadn't chosen the position. It had simply been where the last open space was when she'd arrived 6 minutes late because of her knee. "Number 22, the agency clerk called out, not looking up from his ledger. He was a young man with ink-stained fingers and the particular confidence of someone who had never been evaluated by anyone in his life. Trained in household management, speaks clean English, no encumbrances. The woman 2 spots down from May stepped forward, and 3 ranchers moved toward her immediately. May watched the transaction with the focused attention of someone studying a problem she intended to solve. She'd been passed over in Abilene because a ranch wife had decided she looked too young. She'd been passed over in Tucson because a foreman said her hands were too small for the work, and May had stood there holding her tongue so hard it bled because she had delivered a calf with those hands the previous spring, with no help and no light except a single lamp, and the mother and the calf had both lived when every man present had already written them off. She had learned after Tucson to stop expecting fairness. She had not yet learned to stop hoping for it. That was her most persistent weakness, and she was aware of it. "Number 23, the clerk called. Experienced with poultry and kitchen gardens. Good health record." Another woman stepped forward. 2 ranchers. A brief conversation. Done. May adjusted her grip on her satchel. She carried it everywhere, and it was heavier than it looked. Packed the way she packed it, the folded leather examination roll with its loops for the small instruments. 2 jars of tincture wrapped in cloth so they wouldn't crack against each other. The copy of Blakiston's Domestic Medicine with the cracked spine and the pages she'd annotated in pencil over 4 years of actual use. Willow bark in a paper packet. A bone-handled probe her father had given her the year before he died. A folded copy of the survey records from the Haverford parcel, which she'd done the plat work on 2 seasons back and kept as proof of capability in the same way some women kept references from former employers. She wasn't sure why she'd brought the survey records today. Force of habit, maybe, or stubbornness. She often found it hard to separate the two. Number 24. Her. May stepped forward. The clerk looked up for the first time and then looked back down almost immediately, which told her everything. He found whatever he was looking for in her file, and he read it with the expression of a man discovering a bill he wasn't planning to pay. "May Harper," he said flat. 31, widowed, previous placements 3. He paused, and she could see him deciding whether to say the next part. He said it. Agency notes indicate a prior placement ended following an injury concern. Left knee. He looked up again. Is that still an issue, Miss Harper? Every rancher within earshot glanced at her knee. She felt the attention move across her body like a cold hand. My knee locks in the cold, she said clearly and without apology. I manage it. It has not prevented me from completing any placed work to date. Previous employer noted limited mobility during winter months. Previous employer noted it, May said, and then asked me to stay on for a third season, which I declined in order to take the Flagstaff placement. The letter of reference is in my file. The clerk shuffled papers. He found the letter. He did not read it aloud. Not a single rancher stepped forward. The man who had been studying the fence post to her left actually turned away. She watched his back as he moved down the line toward a younger woman with strong shoulders and no visible complications, and she breathed through her nose and kept her face exactly still. 11 days. She had 11 days before the agency reviewed inactive placements and pulled her file. After that, she would not be relisted. The clerk had told her this 3 weeks ago in the tone of a man doing her a mercy by being direct, and she had thanked him with the same tone and walked back to her boarding room and sat on the edge of the bed for a very long time. She was not going to lose her file. She was not going to go back to Wichita and teach needlework at the church auxiliary, which was what her sister kept gently suggesting every third letter. She was not going to be the kind of woman who gave up because a clerk had noted her knee in a file. She stood in the placement yard and she waited. The line emptied out in pieces. Women moved away with their new employers or their new arrangements, some looking relieved, some looking resigned. One young woman with red hair crying quietly into her handkerchief, while the matron from the agency pressed a firm hand between her shoulder blades. The yard got quieter. The October light went flat and gray. By 11 o'clock, May was the only one left. The clerk began to close his ledger. I'll wait, May said. He looked at her over the top of the book. Miss Harper, I don't believe... I'll wait, she said again. He sighed through his nose and didn't close the ledger all the way. She heard the gate at the far end of the yard open. She didn't turn immediately. She had trained herself out of turning too quickly because it looked desperate, and desperation in a placement yard was the same as blood in water. She finished counting to 3 in her head and then turned. The man coming through the gate was not what she expected, although she would have struggled to say exactly what she had been expecting at that point, given that she had given up on expectations approximately 90 minutes ago. He was lean in the way that outdoor work made men lean, not spare or underfed, but worn down to the essential, the way a tool got when it was used well for a long time. He had dark hair going gray at the edges, and the particular set to his jaw of a man who had made most of his significant decisions alone, and wasn't certain that had been wise. He moved through the yard like a man who wasn't used to being watched and didn't much care for it, and he came directly toward May without looking at the clerk or at the now empty space where the rest of the line had been. He stopped 8 feet away. He didn't look at her knee. She noted this. He looked at her hands. You're the last one, he said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't a judgment. It was the same voice a man used when he was reading a situation accurately and deciding what to do about it. I am, May said. Caleb Ward, he said. I run the Dunn Creek spread, 20 miles north. Cattle, some horses, a sick hand who I can't afford to lose and can't seem to get well. May felt something in her chest shift slightly, the way a mechanism does when the right pressure is applied. What are his symptoms? Ward looked at her steadily. Fever. On and off for 9 days. Can't hold food. His hands shake. Water source. He blinked. It was the first time his expression changed. What? Your water source, May said. Where does your water come from? A well, a creek, a spring. Creek, he said. Dunn Creek. That's where we... He stopped. That's where the name comes from. Has anyone tested it since the summer drought? She set her satchel down on the ground and unbuckled the top flap. Because what you're describing, intermittent fever, gastrointestinal failure tremor, can follow from contaminated surface water. particularly after a drought drops flow levels and organic material concentrates. Has he been the only one drinking from it, or has the whole ranch been on that water? Ward was very still. Hank the Hand, he's been drinking from the creek longer than the others, he said slowly. He's particular about it. Doesn't like the taste from the barrel. Then the barrel water is probably safe, and the creek water isn't. She found the leather examination roll and stood up, leaving the satchel on the ground. I'd need to see him to be certain, but that's where I'd start. Ward looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at her satchel on the ground, the flap open, the roll in her hands, the calm in her face. You've done this before, he said. Several times. The agency notes a concern about your knee. My knee locks in cold weather. She said the same word she'd used with the clerk, but without the defiance this time because he hadn't said it as a weapon. I manage it with heat and movement. I can do every physical task the placement requires. I can also diagnose contaminated water by symptom pattern and treat the resulting illness. Identify land survey discrepancies from county plat records and read a cattle herd for disease markers before the symptoms present visibly. If you want, you can write down what I can't do, and we can see if the list is longer than the one for the woman with strong shoulders who just left with the Pembury Ranch. Something shifted in his face. It might have been the beginning of a smile, or it might have been something quieter than that. How soon can you be ready to go? He said. I'm ready now, May said. He looked at the satchel. Just the one bag. I travel light. He nodded once the way a man nodded when he'd made a decision and was done reconsidering it. We'll need to stop at Henley's for supplies. Creek water issue means I'll need to get the barrel system extended before the first hard freeze. You'll want to boil the creek water for your cattle as well until you can test it, May said. If it's affecting a human with recurring exposure, it can do the same to a herd. Slower presentation, but the same mechanism. Ward stopped walking. He turned back and looked at her with an expression she had seen only a handful of times in her life on the face of her father, when she'd solved a problem he hadn't expected her to solve on the face of the Flagstaff foreman, when her survey work had saved him $2,000 in boundary litigation on the face of the midwife in Abilene who had watched her deliver the calf. It was the expression of a man recalibrating. All right, Caleb Ward said. Come on then. May picked up her satchel. Her knee was still stiff, but the cold had let up slightly in the last hour, and she moved without hesitation, because hesitation in the first hour was the kind of thing that settled into permanent doubt, and she had no room for permanent doubt. The clerk called after them. Mr. Ward, you haven't signed the placement papers. Bring them out to the spread. Ward said, not turning around. I'll sign them there. The clerk started to sputter something about protocol. May didn't turn back either. The gate clanged shut behind them. The yard was empty. She had 11 days to prove herself. She intended to use every one of them. Caleb Ward's wagon was a working vehicle, scarred and functional, with tools roped along the sideboard and a canvas folded over the seat back that had seen better seasons. May put her satchel behind the seat and settled herself on the right side, her bad knee positioned so she could shift her weight off it when the road got rough. He didn't offer her help up, and she didn't need it, which she suspected was something he'd calculated before she got in. They drove north in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, which told her something about him. Uncomfortable men filled silence with noise. Ward drove like he moved through a placement yard, with his attention on what was in front of him, and no wasted effort anywhere else. She used the time to take inventory. His hands on the reins were knuckled and scarred, one finger set crooked from an old brake that hadn't been set right. His coat was good canvas, not new, but well-maintained, which meant he was careful with his equipment. The horse was a gray gelding, well-muscled and responsive to small pressure, which meant Ward's horsemanship was quiet, and consistent men who were rough with horses had horses that required more correction, not less. The wagon bed behind her held grain sacks, a coil of heavy wire, a post-pounder she recognized as the heavier iron type used for rocky ground. He ran a working spread, not show. How long has Hank Riley been with you? She asked. 11 years, Ward said. Since I bought the spread. And before he got sick, was he the only one doing morning chores at the creek line? Most mornings. He kept his eyes on the road. He likes the early quiet. Always has. How old is he? 53. Older systems process contamination slower, she said. He's not going to get better on his own. You've probably tried feeding him through the fever. Broth. My neighbor Martha Boone sends it over. Good. Broth is right. But if the source hasn't been removed, if he's been drinking from the creek even infrequently since the illness started, the treatment doesn't hold. You've been fighting the fever without removing the cause. Ward was quiet for a moment. I told him to drink from the barrel. Did he? Another pause. Hank does what he reckons is best. Then the first thing I'll need to do is sit with him long enough that he trusts me, May said. Because telling a sick 53-year-old man to change his habits through a bedroom door hasn't been working, and I need him alive and working by first freeze. Ward turned his head and looked at her for the first time since they'd left the yard. It was a measuring look, not hostile, the look of someone encountering something that didn't fit a prior category and deciding how to accommodate it. You're sure about the water, he said. I'm sure enough to be right 9 times in 10, she said. And on the 10th time, I'd still recommend switching the source until we rule it out, because the cost of being wrong about contamination is higher than the cost of being wrong about anything else on a ranch. He turned back to the road. Fair enough, he said. They reached Henley's supply store at the edge of town 20 minutes later. Ward climbed down, and May climbed down on her own, her knee catching once on the step, so that she had to take it slowly, and Ward waited at the nose of the horse with his back turned, which she recognized as the particular Western courtesy of a man who had decided not to make things awkward. She appreciated it more than she would have appreciated help. Inside Henley's was the kind of supply store that told you everything about a region, the shelves overstocked in rope and hardware, the medicine cabinet sparse 2 grades of flour and only 1 grade of coffee. May found the medicinal section without being directed and scanned it with practiced efficiency. Willow bark she had. Peppermint oil useful. There was a bottle of ginger tincture old but sealed, which would help with the stomach. No iron sulfate, which she would have liked for water testing, but she could improvise. She brought her selections to the counter. The man behind it, Henley himself, by the look of the proprietary ease with which he occupied the space, glanced at her items and then up at her with an expression that categorized her quickly and not flatteringly. These for Ward, he said. They're for a patient, she said. Do you carry iron compounds? Any sulfate or vitriol? This a placement woman, Henley said, looking past her toward Ward. She is, Ward said from behind May. Do you have what she's asking for? Henley's expression shifted slightly. Got some old copper sulfate from a fence treatment batch, not medicine grade. Chemical testing doesn't require medicine grade, May said. How old? 2 seasons. Still sealed. Sealed. I'll take half a pound, she said, and a length of white cotton muslin if you have it. He brought the items without further commentary, which was the particular efficiency of a man who had done the math on arguing and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. May laid out the coin's exact count and tucked the muslin under her arm. Ward said nothing as they walked back to the wagon. She counted that as a good sign. You're going to test the water today, he said when they were back on the road. This afternoon if there's daylight enough, she said. I want to see the test results before I make any specific treatment claims to Hank. He needs a reason to trust me, and I'd rather give him evidence than authority. Ward nodded slowly. Martha Boone, he said after a moment. My neighbor. She's going to want to meet you. Is that a problem? Not at all. She's the kind of woman who would have bought you at that yard herself if she'd needed a placement. He said it straightforwardly without performance, and May recognized it as a compliment of the most useful kind, the kind that was also just an accurate description. What does she know about the land out here? May said. More than me, and I've been here 11 years. Good, May said, because I've been looking at the regional plat maps since I got my current agency assignment, and there are some boundary notations around Dunn Creek that don't read right to me. Ward turned his head again. This time the look was sharper. What kind of boundary notations? The kind that suggests someone has been filing incremental claims against the creek access easements, May said. Probably for the last 2 or 3 seasons, if I'm reading the progression correctly. Small enough adjustments each time that they'd be easy to miss if you weren't looking at the cumulative picture. The jaw tightened. Victor Doyle. She looked at him. Bank agent, Ward said flat. He's been pushing at the water rights since last spring. Said there were survey inconsistencies in the original deed. Were there? Not that I could find, but I'm a rancher, not a surveyor. I am, May said. Both technically. I did plat work on the Haverford parcel 2 seasons ago, and I testified before the county clerk on a deed discrepancy case in Flagstaff. She reached into her satchel and found the folded survey records she'd brought without quite knowing why. These are from the Haverford parcel, but the baseline survey data for this region is the same. Give me access to your deed records and the county filings, and I'll tell you whether Doyle has a legitimate claim or whether he's manufacturing one. Ward was very quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 15 seconds. You brought survey records, he said, to a placement yard. I bring them everywhere, she said. Force of habit. He exhaled once through his nose. Miss Harper, he said. May, she said. If I'm going to be on your spread through first freeze, Miss Harper is going to get tedious. May, he said. He seemed to be tasting the word for reliability the way he might test a plank for load bearing. I reckon today is shaping up different than I figured when I left the house this morning. I reckon so, she said. And she meant it as an agreement rather than a boast, because the morning had surprised her too, and she hadn't been surprised by anything in a long time. The wagon went north. The creek country opened up around them, brown and dry from the drought. The creek line visible from the road as a darker seam in the land lower than it should have been. May watched it as they passed. The water was wrong. She could see it from here, the surface color, the way the current moved through the narrowed channel. She had seen it before in Abilene and once outside Santa Fe, and she had been right both times. Hank Riley was going to live. The land was going to be saved. She didn't say either of those things out loud. She was not the kind of woman who made promises before she'd done the work. But she looked at the creek line, and she felt for the first time in 11 days the thing that was better than hope. Certainty. Caleb Ward drove the wagon and said nothing, and May Harper sat beside him with her satchel across her knees and the survey records folded in her coat pocket, and the gray gelding moved north at a steady pace into the dry October country. And nobody in the placement yard at Callows Creek gave them a second thought. That would change soon enough. The Dunn Creek spread announced itself before they reached it, not through grandeur, but through the particular silence of a place that had been working too hard for too long. May heard it in the way Ward's shoulders settled when the wagon turned through the gate, the exhale of a man returning to a problem he hadn't solved yet. Hank Riley was in this bunkhouse. She heard him before she saw him, a cough that started dry and finished wet, the kind of cough that had been living in a chest for too many days and had gotten comfortable. She didn't knock. She walked in, set her satchel on the floor beside the narrow cot, and looked at the man lying in it. Hank Riley was not a small man, but illness had made him look small, the particular deflation of a large frame when the force inside it had been running at half capacity for too long. He had a grizzled jaw and pale gray eyes that sharpened the moment she walked in, a man who had been waiting for something to happen and wasn't entirely sure he was glad it finally had. "Who are you?" he said. "Not hostile, just direct." "May Harper," she said. "I'm the new placement." She sat on the stool beside the cot without asking permission, which she found worked better than asking. "I need to ask you some questions, and then I need to examine you. If you answer the questions honestly, I won't have to guess at the examination." He looked past her toward the door, where Ward was standing with his arms folded and his face neutral. She always talked like this. "About 2 hours acquaintance," Ward said. "So far, yes." Hank made a sound that was either a laugh or a cough, and turned out to be both. "All right. Ask," she asked. She worked through it systematically, the fever pattern when it spiked, when it dropped, whether the shaking was constant or intermittent, what he could keep down and what he couldn't, how long since he'd had a full night of sleep. He answered in the clipped, factual way of a man who had been self-sufficient for 53 years and found illness an irritating administrative problem. "Your water," she said. "How much have you been drinking from the creek since you got sick?" He was quiet for a moment. "Some." "How much is some?" "A man gets thirsty," he said with the particular dignity of someone defending a position they already suspected was indefensible. "Hank," Ward said from the door, "I know what you're going to say." "I'd like you to let May finish saying it," Ward said. May kept her voice level. "The water in that creek is contaminated. I don't know the specific compound yet. I'm testing it this afternoon, but the symptom pattern you're showing fits water contamination from an organic source better than it fits anything else. Every time you drink from that creek, you reintroduce whatever is making you sick. That's why the fever keeps coming back. That's why you can't get better." She paused. "You're not failing to recover. You've been recovering. You just keep getting poisoned again." The room was very quiet. Hank Riley looked at the ceiling. He had the expression of a man reassessing a significant number of choices. "The barrel water tastes like iron," he said. "I know, I'll fix that." She had no idea yet how she'd fix it, but she would, because the alternative was a 53-year-old man dying of stubbornness and creek water, and she was not prepared to allow that. "Starting today, no creek water. Not a cup, not a mouthful. Is that understood?" He looked at her. His pale gray eyes were steadier than the rest of him. "You're sure," he said. "Sure enough to stale my professional reputation on it," she said. "Which is the only thing I own outright, so I protect it carefully." Something moved through his face. Not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "All right," he said. "No creek water. Good." She stood and picked up her satchel. "I'm going to draw from the barrel now and test both sources side by side. I'll have results before supper, and then I'll tell you exactly what we're dealing with and how we're going to treat it." She looked at Ward. "I'll need a cook fire and 2 clean pails." "I'll get them," Ward said. "And the deed records," she said. "When you have a moment." His eyes held hers for half a second. Those two. She left the bunkhouse with her satchel over one shoulder and the October air hitting her face and her knee stiff, but functional. And she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of deep breathing before she got to work. The water test took the better part of 2 hours and confirmed what she already knew. She did it at the cook fire beside the main house with the copper sulfate solution and the muslin and the improvised titration that she'd learned from a field physician in Abilene, who had treated a water contamination case so severe that 3 families had lost children before anyone identified the source. She had stood at that man's elbow for 4 hours asking questions, and she had never forgotten a single answer. The creek water turned. The barrel water didn't. She carried the results to the bunkhouse and showed them to Hank without softening them, because she found sick men responded better to precision than to reassurance. He looked at the muslin squares laid side by side and then up at her. "I did that to myself," he said. "The drought did it," she said. "You just didn't know the creek had changed." She paused. "Most men in your position wouldn't have made a different choice." "Don't patronize me," he said, but without heat. "I'm not," she said. "I'm telling you the truth. The creek looked the same. It didn't smell. There was no way to know without testing, and nobody had the equipment to test." She began laying out what she needed from her satchel. "Now I do, and now we know. That's where we are." He watched her work with the focused attention of a man who had nothing else to do and had decided to use the time well. "Where'd you learn all this?" "My father was a physician," she said. "Rural practice, eastern Oklahoma. I assisted him from the time I was 9 until he died." She uncapped the ginger tincture. "After that, I found that the skills transferred to livestock work more readily than they transferred to the kind of work women were expected to do. So I went where the skills were useful." "And your husband?" She kept her hands moving. "He died 3 years ago. Pneumonia." "I'm sorry for it." "So am I," she said, and meant it simply, without performance. She'd had 3 years to get the grief into a manageable form, and she'd done that work, and what was left was something clear and factual. She had loved a man, and he had died, and she had kept going because stopping wasn't an option, she recognized. "The rancher," Hank said with the careful casualness of someone approaching a topic sideways. "Ward, he chose you at the yard." "He was the last man there," she said. "He left the spread at first light," Hank said. 3-hour ride. He could have gone earlier and had his pick. He waited." She looked up. Hank's pale gray eyes were perfectly innocent. "Just mentioning it," he said. She went back to the tincture. "Drink this," she said. "It'll stop the cramping tonight so you can actually sleep." "What is it?" "Ginger and peppermint. It tastes exactly as bad as it sounds." He took the cup and drank it in 2 long swallows and made a face of extraordinary suffering. "Lord Almighty." "It'll work in about an hour," she said. "I'll bring you something better tasting in the morning. Sleep on your left side if the cramping comes back, it helps the motility." She left him propped against his pillow with the instruction to call out if the fever spiked above what they'd measured, and she found Ward at the main house at the table with a stack of deed records in front of him, and 2 cups of coffee, and the expression of a man who had been thinking hard about several things at once. He pushed the second cup toward her when she sat. She accepted it and looked at the stack. "Victor Doyle," she said. "How long has he been filing?" "He came out first in April," Ward said. "Said the original survey on the east parcel had an error. Showed me a county document with what he claimed was a corrected boundary line. Took about 2 feet off my creek access." 2 feet? May said. "Said it was a minor adjustment, historical oversight." His voice was flat in the way voices got when the speaker had been angry for a long time and had compressed the anger into something more efficient. I pushed back. He came back in June with a second document. Said there was a 3rd and 4th survey on record that I hadn't seen. "Were there?" "Couldn't say. I don't know the survey system the way the county does." He looked at her. "Do you?" "I do." She pulled the stack toward her. "The regional baseline survey for this water district was completed in 1871. Every subsequent plat adjustment is supposed to be filed as an amendment to the base record with a reference number that corresponds to the original parcel description." She began going through the pages. "If Doyle is presenting documents without those reference numbers, or with numbers that don't match the baseline filing, he's presenting fabrications." Ward didn't move. He watched her hands move through his documents with the particular stillness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for months and was watching someone else pick it up. "Can you prove that?" he said. "Depends what he's filed," she said. "Give me an hour." She went through the deed records the way she'd gone through everything in her life that mattered methodically, without rushing, because rushing produced mistakes, and mistakes in land disputes produced consequences that lasted decades. The documents told a story, and like most stories told by interested parties, this one had seams in it. The first 3 filings were legitimate. Old work, properly referenced, cross-matched to the 1871 base survey with the correct parcel notation. Ward's ownership was clean on those parcels, clear and incontestable. Then she found the June filing. She read it twice. Then she set it down and picked up the 1871 base survey reference she'd brought from her satchel, and she read them side by side, and the seam opened up like a fault line. "Mr. Ward," she said. He was at the window. He turned. "The reference number on this June filing corresponds to a parcel survey in this district," she said, "but not to your parcel. It corresponds to a survey conducted on the Haverford land 2 miles east of here." She held the document up. Victor Doyle took a legitimate survey reference number from an adjacent parcel and applied it to a fabricated boundary adjustment for your property, which means anyone looking at just this document would see a valid reference number and assume the underlying survey was real. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. "He forged it," Ward said. "He used a real number from a real document to authenticate a false one," May said. "Which is more sophisticated than outright forgery and harder to catch if you don't have the base survey records to compare against." She set the document down. "But I do have them. And now we both know." Ward crossed the room in 3 strides and looked at the documents himself. He read with the careful focus of a man who was not a quick reader but was a thorough one, and when he finished, he looked up at her with an expression she hadn't quite seen on his face before. "He's coming back," Ward said. "He told me last week. Said he had a 3rd document, bank representative this time." "When?" "He didn't say exactly. Soon." May looked at the documents. "Then we need to be ready before he gets here." Martha Boone arrived the next morning on a roan mare with a pot of soup tied to her saddle and the sharp eyes of a woman who had lived in that country long enough to read everything the land could offer, and most of what the people in it could offer too. She was 61, broad-shouldered, with white hair worn in a practical knot and hands that told 40 years of ranch work in every callus. She dismounted without assistance and carried the soup pot into the main house and set it on the stove, and then turned and looked at May with an expression that was pure assessment, clear and unashamed. "So you're the one Caleb brought back from Callows Creek," she said. "May Harper," May said. "Martha Boone. I run the spread north of the creek line." She sat down at the table without being invited, which May respected enormously. "Hank any better?" "Marginally," May said. "He slept 4 hours last night, which is the first real sleep he's had in 2 weeks. If we can keep him off the creek water another 4 days, the fever should break." "You sure it's the water?" "I tested it yesterday," May said. "I can show you the results." Martha looked at her. Then she looked at the deed records spread on the table, which May had been annotating since first light. "You've been into Caleb's deed records. He asked me to look at them." "She found something," Ward said from the doorway. He came in and poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter. "Doyle's June filing is fraudulent." She traced the survey reference to the Haverford parcel. Martha was very still. "Say that again." May explained it the same way she had to Ward, concise and precise with the documents laid out, so Martha could follow the thread herself. The older woman listened with the full attention of someone who had known for months that something was wrong and had lacked only the specific language to name it. "I knew those boundaries were wrong," Martha said when May finished. "I've ridden that creek line since 1879. The eastern easement goes 20 feet further than what Doyle was claiming." She pressed one finger flat on the table. "He tried the same thing with me, 2 months before he came to Caleb. I told him to get off my land or I'd remove him." "Did he have documents with you?" May said. "He had a paper," Martha said. "I didn't let him read it. If I'd known then what you just showed me." She stopped, looked at May with the particular expression of someone redirecting frustration into focus. "Can you build a case from what you've found?" "I can build documentation," May said. "What we need is a county surveyor to come out and physically reestablish the boundary markers, which will create an official record that supersedes anything Doyle can present. In the meantime, I can prepare a written comparison of the fraudulent filing against the base survey record, with the discrepancy annotated and sourced." She paused. "If Doyle comes with a bank representative, that document gives Ward standing to contest the claim formally rather than just verbally." Martha Boone looked at her for a long measuring moment. Then she looked at Ward. "Where exactly did you find her?" she said. "She was the last one left," Ward said. "Well," Martha said, with the satisfaction of a woman whose theory had been confirmed. "That tells you something about what gets left behind." The county surveyor couldn't come for 6 days. May spent every one of them working. She was at Hank's bedside before breakfast and at the deed records after supper, with the hours between given to the ranch work itself. The cattle examination, the fence assessments, the barrel water system that she and Ward extended by hand through the east pasture on the 3rd day. Digging the trench line together in the cold ground. May on the mattock with her left knee braced against the terrain, and Ward on the post driver with the efficient rhythm of a man who had been doing physical labor long enough that it had become a kind of language. They talked while they worked, the way people talked when the work gave them cover to say things that would have felt too pointed in a still room. "You said your father was a physician," Ward said. He drove a post and waited while May positioned the next one. "In the Oklahoma Territory," she said. before the formal certification requirements. He was the only doctor in a 50-mile range. People came with everything: broken bones, fever, childbirth complications, infected wounds. She set the post and stepped back. I was with him on almost all of it. And after he died, I married. My husband ran a small cattle operation. I did the books and the animal care and some of the pasture work. She handed Ward the driver. When he died, I tried to keep it going for a year by myself, but the bank had a lien on the property that I hadn't known about. He hadn't told me, and it went. She said it matter-of-factly because it was fact-finished and passed. After that, the agency. Ward drove the post in silence for a moment. He didn't tell you about the lien? No. Why not? Because men of his particular temperament believed that financial difficulties were a personal failure, and personal failures were not discussed with wives. She picked up the next post. I'd have helped him if I'd known. I was already doing the books. I would have seen it. She paused. But he didn't tell me. And then he died, and then the bank came, and here I am. Ward took the post from her. He looked at it before he said it, not at her, but she had learned in 4 days that that was often when he was paying closest attention, when he appeared to be looking at something else. That's a hard run, he said. It's a run, she said. I've seen harder. He set the post and positioned the driver. Doyle's going to come before the surveyor does, he said. She'd been thinking the same thing. I know. Are we ready? She considered the documentation she'd assembled. The annotated comparison, the source discrepancy, the written account from Martha Boone about the Haverford parcel reference. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to prevent a quick kill. We're ready enough, she said. If he comes with the bank man and tries to make a formal claim, we can delay it long enough for the surveyor to get here. She looked at the water line they'd been extending. The bigger risk is the water. If Doyle has any claim on creek access, even a temporary one, while the dispute is open, he could move to restrict the spread's use of it while the county reviews. He'd do it too, Ward said. He'd do it just to create pressure. Then we need alternative water secured before he arrives, May said. She'd already been thinking about this. The spring on the north pasture, how reliable is it in winter? Ward looked up. How do you know about the north pasture spring? I walked the property this morning, she said. He looked at her with the expression she was getting to recognize, the recalibrating look, the category adjustment look. It runs through February most years, sometimes longer. Can you run a line from there to the main trough? It's a 1/4 mile. I know, she said. Can you run it? He was quiet for 3 seconds. With help. I'll help, she said. And Martha said she'd send her hand over if we needed it. He looked at her steadily. You talked to Martha about this already. This morning, she said. When she brought breakfast, something moved through his face. She'd been cataloging the things that moved through his face. It was a controlled face, a face that had learned to give very little away, and so the things that did move through it meant something. This one was not quite a smile, and not quite wonder, but it was somewhere between the two, and it settled there for a moment before he put it away. All right, he said. We'll start the spring line tomorrow. She nodded and picked up the next post, and they went back to work. And the silence between them was the particular silence of two people who had learned that working beside each other was a language they were both fluent in, and that it said more than most speech. On the 5th day, Hank Riley's fever broke. May was there for it. She had been checking his temperature every 4 hours, and at 3 in the morning on the 5th day, she came into the bunkhouse with her lamp and found him sitting up in the cot instead of lying flat. And the sweat on his face was the productive sweat of a fever breaking rather than the dry heat of one entrenching, and she put her hand against his forehead and felt the difference and allowed herself one long, controlled exhale. It's gone, she said. Hank looked at her. His face in the lamplight had more color in it than it had had in weeks. You sure? Yes, she said. It may come back once more. A small recurrence that's normal as the system clears. But the primary infection is breaking. Your body is winning. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was rougher than usual for reasons that weren't physical. I thought I was done. I know, she said. She sat on the stool. You weren't. Caleb sat with me 3 nights in a row when it was bad, Hank said. Didn't sleep, just sat there. He looked at his hands. Man doesn't do that for a hand, not most men. No, May agreed. He didn't want to call it, Hank said. I knew he was scared he was going to lose me, but he never said it. He paused. You going to stay past the placement? May was quiet. I don't know yet, she said, which was the most honest answer she could give. He won't ask you, Hank said. That's just how he is. He'll find a reason to make it practical, another job that needs doing, another piece of work he needs help with, and he'll call that asking. He looked at her with his clear gray eyes. I'm just telling you so you know what it looks like when it comes. She looked at the man in the cot, the man who had very nearly died of creek water and stubbornness, and she felt something she hadn't felt since Flagstaff, the specific warmth of being somewhere that was beginning against all reasonable expectation to feel like it might be hers. She didn't say that. She said, Go back to sleep. You have work to do in 4 days, and you need to rebuild your strength. He grinned, and it was the first full grin she'd seen from him, and it looked like health. Yes, ma'am. She walked back to the main house in the dark and cold, her knee protesting mildly, and she looked up at the sky over the Dunn Creek spread, with its thousands of stars burning hard and clear in the October cold. And she thought about Hank's question, and didn't answer it even in the privacy of her own mind, because some answers needed more information before they were safe to believe. Then she went inside and sat down at the deed records and kept working, because Victor Doyle was coming and she intended to be ready for him. He arrived on the 6th day, 2 hours before the county surveyor. May was in the main house when she heard the wagon on the road, 2 horses moving with the confident pace of men who expected to be received rather than resisted. She looked up from the annotated survey comparison she'd been finalizing and heard Ward's boots on the porch boards. She put the documents in order. The fraudulent June filing the 1871 base survey with her annotations. The written statement from Martha Boone. The water test results with the contamination findings clearly marked. She stacked them with the care of a woman building an argument, because that was precisely what she was doing. Then she picked them up and walked outside. Victor Doyle was a large man, well-fed and well-dressed, in a way that was several degrees too careful for a man who claimed to be doing routine county business. He had the smile of a man who had decided in advance that this was going to go his way and was already performing the graciousness of a gracious winner. Beside him, the bank representative was younger and less certain, holding a leather satchel with both hands. Doyle's smile held when he saw May, and then fractured very slightly at the corners when he registered the stack of documents in her hands. Mr. Ward, he said, not looking at May. I believe we have some unfinished business. We do, Ward said. He was standing on the porch with his arms at his sides, not folded, not aggressive, simply present and settled in the way of a man who intended to stay exactly where he was. This is Miss Harper, Ward said. She manages the business records for the Dunn Creek spread. Doyle's eyes moved to May then. They did the inventory quickly. Her age, her gender, her knee, her lack of immediate impressiveness. And they dismissed most of what they found, which was a mistake May had given up feeling offended by, because she found it so consistently useful. Miss Harper, Doyle said with the particular courtesy of a man who wanted to be seen being courteous to someone he found inconsequential. I'm Victor Doyle. I represent the county land office and several interested banking parties in a matter regarding the eastern boundary. The eastern boundary on the 1871 base survey, May said. Yes, I've been reviewing that. He paused. The survey errors, I should say. There are no survey errors in the original filing, May said. She took the top document from her stack and held it out, not to Doyle, but to the bank representative. This is the 1871 base survey for this district with the parcel reference for the Dunn Creek spread highlighted. The reference number is 14-7-C. The bank representative took it. The document Mr. Doyle presented in June of this year, which purported to show a boundary adjustment. She took the second document from her stack and held it out in the same way. References survey number 14-7-C. However, survey 14-7-C does not correspond to this parcel. It corresponds to the Haverford parcel 2 miles east of here. She paused long enough for the bank representative to look at both documents. I have the Haverford parcel survey here as well if you'd like to verify. The silence was very specific. It had weight and direction. Doyle's jaw had tightened. There may be a clerical. The same reference number appears in a second document presented to Martha Boone of the North, spread 2 months before Mr. Doyle's first visit here, May said. Mrs. Boone has provided a written account which I can share. She looked directly at Doyle for the first time. The reference number didn't land on 2 separate false boundary adjustments by clerical error, Mr. Doyle. It was selected specifically because it's a legitimate number attached to a real survey, which makes it credible to anyone who doesn't have access to the actual base records. The bank representative looked at Doyle. It was the specific look of a younger man realizing that the person who had brought him somewhere had not told him everything. I'd like to see the Haverford survey, the bank representative said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had just moved from one side of a line to the other. May handed it to him. Doyle said nothing. His face had the concentrated stillness of a man performing rapid calculations and not liking the results. Ward came down 1 step from the porch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The county surveyor will be here in 2 hours, he said. He's going to re-establish the eastern boundary markers from the original base survey. Once that's done, there won't be any further ambiguity about what belongs to this spread. He looked at Doyle. You're welcome to wait and watch, or you're welcome to go. But I'll need both those documents back before you leave, since they're part of the official record we'll be submitting to the county clerk. The bank representative handed both documents back to May without being asked. Doyle looked at Ward. He looked at May. He looked at the stack of documents in her hands, and the steady way she was holding them, and the fact that she had not at any point in the last 6 minutes shown the smallest sign of backing down. We'll be in touch through the county office, he said. We'll be ready, May said. He climbed back into the wagon. The bank representative climbed up on the other side, and May noticed he did not look at Doyle once while he was doing it. The wagon went back down the road. Ward was at her shoulder. She hadn't heard him move. That's not the last of him, Ward said quietly. No, May agreed. But it's the last time he'll come here thinking he can do it fast. She looked at the documents in her hands. He'll regroup and find a different angle. We need the surveyor's official record in hand before he does. Ward was quiet for a moment. May, he said. She looked at him. He was facing the road the same direction the wagon had gone, and his profile had the look of a man choosing his words with more care than usual. Thank you, he said. It wasn't elaborate, and it wasn't performative. It was the specific gratitude of a man who had been carrying something alone for a long time, and had felt it lift, and who didn't quite have the language for that experience, and so was using the simplest version of it. She looked back at the road. There's work left to do, she said. I know, he said. They stood there a moment longer. The October light flat and clean around the Dunn Creek spread, and somewhere in the north pasture, the spring line they'd built together carried water silently toward the main trough, and in the bunkhouse, Hank Riley was sleeping the sound sleep of a man whose fever had finally broken, and who had decided without any further evidence required that things were going to be all right. May did not yet let herself believe that. But she was closer than she had been yesterday, and that she had learned was how the important things began. The county surveyor's name was Edmund Briggs, and he arrived 2 hours after Doyle left exactly as Ward had said, driving a mud-spattered buggy with his equipment case strapped to the back and the unhurried manner of a man who had been settling land disputes for 23 years and had long since stopped being surprised by what people were willing to do to each other over a property line. He shook Ward's hand, and then May's, and when May handed him the annotated comparison documents, he read them standing in the yard without being asked to sit down, and when he finished, he looked at her over the top of the pages with the careful attention of a professional encountering work that met his standard. "You did this yourself," he said. "Yes," she said. "Where'd you train?" "Field work," she said. "Haverford parcel 2 seasons back, and a boundary dispute case in Flagstaff before that." He looked at the documents again. "This reference number discrepancy, you cross-checked it against the district master registry." "I used the 1871 base survey," she said. "I don't have the district master registry, but the base survey is the source document for all subsequent amendments, and the parcel notation on Doyle's filing contradicts it directly." Briggs folded the documents with the precise care of a man adding them to a mental case file. "I'll need to walk the eastern boundary before I can make anything official," he said. "But from what I'm reading here, the original markers should put the creek access easement well inside Ward's legal property line." He looked at Ward. "Who's been letting Doyle file these amendments without contesting?" "I didn't know I could," Ward said. "Most people don't," Briggs said, not unkindly. "Doyle knows that. It's the whole mechanism." He tucked the documents under his arm. "Let's go walk the line." They walked it, Ward and Briggs and May, with Hank watching from the bunkhouse window, because May had told him firmly that he was not walking anywhere yet, and he had argued for 4 minutes and then subsided, because the firmness in her voice was the kind that didn't leave room for productive counter-argument. The eastern boundary took 40 minutes. Briggs found the original iron markers still in the ground, old crusted with rust, but present and unmoved, and he measured from them with his transit level and made his notations in his field book, and said twice things under his breath that May didn't catch, but that had the cadence of a man confirming an existing suspicion. When they came back to the yard, he said, "The original boundary gives you full creek access easement to the first bend. Doyle's claimed adjustment would have put the water line on his client's side of the boundary. If he'd gotten a court to accept the June filing as legitimate, he could have eventually restricted your water access entirely." He said it flatly without drama, which made it more chilling than drama would have. Ward's jaw worked. He was going to cut the water. "When he was ready," Briggs said. "Not all at once, piece by piece, the way he's been doing it. Another filing here, another adjustment there, until the cumulative picture looked like it had always been his client's property, and you'd been the one encroaching." He looked at May. "Your documentation stopped that." "The documentation stopped it," May said. "The original survey stopped it. It was already there. I just read it." Briggs gave her a look that she recognized as professional respect in its most compact form. "I'll file the official resurvey record with the county clerk by end of week," he said. "Once it's in, any subsequent filing from Doyle's parties will have to contend with it directly. It won't be impossible for him to continue, but it'll be considerably harder and considerably more public." He closed his field book. "I'll also note the reference number discrepancy in my official report. That's a matter for the clerk's office to pursue, not me, but it'll be in the record." He shook Ward's hand. He shook May's hand again, with a slightly longer grip, this time the kind that meant something. Then he drove back down the road, and Ward stood in the yard in the thin October light, and May stood beside him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything immediate that needed saying. Then Ward said quietly, "He was going to take the water." "Yes," May said. "If you hadn't been here." "I was here," she said. Not dismissive, just present, just fact. He turned his head and looked at her, and she looked back, and the moment held the particular quality of something settling into a shape it intended to keep. Then Hank called from the bunkhouse window, wanting to know what Briggs had said, and they both turned, and Ward called back with the summary, and Hank made a sound of fierce satisfaction, and something that might have been a curse directed at Doyle's general character, and May allowed herself briefly to smile. She thought they had time. That was the mistake she didn't fully recognize until 3 days later, when Victor Doyle came back, not with the bank representative, not with a wagon, but on horseback and with a man she'd never seen before, who had the particular build of someone employed for physical persuasion rather than legal argument. She was at the north fence line when they rode in. She'd gone out to check the spring water line they'd laid because one of the connections had been running slower than it should, and she'd wanted to investigate before it became a problem in the freeze. She had her tools and her satchel, and she was on her knees beside the pipe connection when she heard the horses. She heard them, and she knew in the way she'd learned to know things through pattern recognition, and the particular quality of hoofbeats that moved with purpose, rather than arrival, that this was not a courtesy call. She stood up. Her knee pulled. She ignored it. By the time she'd covered the distance back to the main yard, Doyle was already off his horse and Ward was on the porch, and the second man had positioned himself at an angle that put him between Ward and the gate, in the way that men positioned themselves when they wanted to convey that leaving was going to be complicated. She came around the corner of the fence line, and Doyle saw her first. His face did something she hadn't seen it do before. It tightened. Not the fractured smile from 6 days ago, something sharper. Something that recognized her as the specific problem she'd become. "Miss Harper," he said. "Mr. Doyle," she said. She kept walking until she was standing on Ward's left, which put her on the porch and put both of them facing Doyle together. She noted that the second man tracked her movement without quite looking like he was tracking it, which was a skill that required practice, and told her something about how he spent his time. "I've been reviewing the resurvey filing," Doyle said to Ward, pointedly to Ward. "I think there are some procedural irregularities in how it was submitted." "Briggs is a county officer," Ward said. "He filed according to his standard process. The standard process requires prior notification to all parties with existing claims against the surveyed parcel," Doyle said. "I had an existing claim on record. I was not notified." May said, "The June filing you're referring to was made under a fraudulent survey reference. An invalid claim doesn't generate notification rights under county procedure." She'd looked this up. She'd looked it up specifically because she'd known this argument was coming in some form, because men like Doyle didn't retreat. They regrouped and found a new angle exactly as she'd told Ward they would. Doyle looked at her. The look was different from the last time. Last time he'd dismissed her. This time, he was recalculating her threat level, and she watched him do it and kept her face neutral. "You've been doing a great deal of research into matters that concern this property," he said with the smile of a man laying something down carefully. "I manage the business records for the Dunn Creek spread," she said. "Land disputes concern this property. You manage the records." He repeated it with a slight emphasis that turned it into something else, into a suggestion that her authority here was provisional temporary, the authority of an employee rather than a principal. "For how long exactly?" Ward said, "Long enough." Doyle shifted his weight and looked at the yard, the outbuildings, the water trough taking inventory. May realized, looking for pressure points. "I'm also here," he said almost gently, "because I've had a report of a water system modification on the north pasture, running a line from the spring to the main trough." "That's our property," Ward said. "The spring," Doyle said, "may be subject to a shared use provision under the original Water District Charter. Springs above a certain output volume are classified as district resources, not private." He paused. "I'd hate to see a man put labor into infrastructure that doesn't belong to him." The silence after that had a different quality than the silences before. This one had teeth. May felt Ward tense beside her. She felt the specific tension of a man who had built something with his hands and was now being told it might not be his, and she understood that particular violence. She'd experienced it herself with the lien she hadn't known about with the spread she'd worked and lost. "The spring output volume," she said, keeping her voice level. "Do you have the district charter with you?" Doyle looked at her. "The classification threshold," she said. "The output volume that triggers the shared use provision. If you have the charter, I'd like to see the specific figure." He didn't have it with him. She could see it in the half-second of recalibration before he spoke. "I can have it to you, because I have the Water District Charter," May said. She had looked this up too through the county records that Briggs had given her access to after the resurvey. The shared use provision applies to springs with a tested output above 40 gallons per minute. Our north spring runs at 11 gallons per minute in October and typically drops to 7 or 8 in winter. She looked at him steadily. That's well below the classification threshold. The spring is private. The second man shifted his weight. The movement was small and deliberate, and it meant something. Ward stepped forward off the porch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't put his hand on his revolver. He simply moved forward until he was standing in the yard between May and Doyle, and he stood there the way a fence post stood, without drama, without apology, with the absolute implication of permanence. "Victor," he said. And the use of the first name was not familiarity, it was reduction. It was the sound of a man stripping away the professional pretense and addressing what was underneath it. "You've come to my spread twice now with documents that don't hold up, and claims that don't have basis, and you've brought a man with you this time that I don't know, and who is standing between me and my gate. I'm going to ask you to leave. I'm going to ask you once, and I'm going to ask you civilly, because that's how I do things." He paused. "But I'm only going to ask once." Doyle looked at Ward. He looked at May. He looked at the documents she was holding, because she'd produced the water charter from her satchel, while she was talking the way she produced everything with the efficiency of someone who'd had it ready. He looked at all of it, and he made the calculation that men like him were always making the calculation of cost versus return of resistance versus opportunity. "We'll be in touch," he said. "Through the county office," May said, in writing. He turned his horse. The second man turned his horse. They rode out through the gate, and Ward watched them go with the expression of a man who had stopped a wound but knew the bleeding wasn't entirely finished. He turned back to May. "How did you know about the Water District Charter?" "Briggs gave me access to the county records after the resurvey," she said. "I read everything in the Water District file." She looked at the road. "He's going to find something I haven't read yet. That's the problem with a man like that. He has time and resources, and he's already decided this is worth pursuing." "Why?" Ward said. "Why this spread specifically?" It was the question she'd been turning over since the first conversation about Doyle. She looked at the creek line, the spring, the water system they'd built. "Water," she said. "This drought isn't a single-season event. Anyone watching the regional patterns can see that. Water-secure land in this district is going to be worth considerably more in 5 years than it is now. Doyle's not acting for the county office. He's acting for whoever hired him to acquire water-adjacent parcels while the drought makes owners desperate enough to settle." She looked at Ward. "He miscalculated with you because you're not desperate. And he miscalculated with me because he didn't expect anyone here who could read the records." Ward absorbed this slowly. "He'll come back." "Yes," she said. "But next time he'll have something real. Something I haven't anticipated." She paused. "So I need to anticipate more." She stayed up past midnight that night going through every county document Briggs had given her access to, looking for the angle she'd missed. She was at the table with the lamp turned up and her third cup of coffee going cold at her elbow when she found it. It wasn't in the land records. It was in the Water District financial filings. A series of assessments against parcels drawing from shared district resources. Small fees going back 4 years. Properly filed, properly signed, using a legitimate county mechanism. But the assessments were applied to the Dunn Creek spread for a resource it wasn't using. The Shared District Creek Diversion, a public water system put in during the 1870s to serve the mining operations that had long since closed, was being billed towards parcel as though the spread was drawing from it. It wasn't. The spread drew from its own creek access and now from the private spring. The diversion ran 2 miles to the south, but the assessments had accumulated for 4 years. And under the Water District Charter, unpaid assessments against a parcel could generate a lien against that property. May sat very still. The lien that had taken her husband's spread had been created the same way, accumulated, quietly filed, properly invisible, until it was too late to contest without legal representation that cost more than the property was worth. Doyle hadn't been creating pressure with the boundary claims. The boundary claims were distraction. The real mechanism was here in the financial filings, in the accumulated assessments, against a resource the spread didn't use and that Ward almost certainly didn't know he'd been billed for. Her hands were steady when she turned the pages. She made them steady because the alternative was useless. She added up 4 years of quarterly assessments. The total was $412. Under the district charter, unpaid assessments became legally actionable after 5 years. The first assessment was filed 4 years and 2 months ago. Doyle had 10 months to make the lien actionable. Unless the assessments were contested and reversed before that, he didn't need the boundary claims. He didn't need the spring classification argument. He'd already built the mechanism to take this land, and he'd buried it in a financial record that nobody looked at because it looked like routine municipal billing. She sat at that table at 12:30 in the morning on the Dunn Creek spread, and she felt the particular cold that came with understanding a thing completely. He'd been planning this for 4 years, before Ward knew he was a target, before the drought had made it urgent. He'd laid the mechanism down in the county records, and he'd been waiting for it to mature. She had 10 months, but she had to move now before Doyle realized she'd found it. She got up and went to Ward's door and knocked. He answered in under 15 seconds, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either, and he opened the door fully dressed, which told her the same thing. "I found it," she said. He looked at her face and stepped back to let her in. She spread the documents on his table and explained it the way she'd explained everything precisely, without softening the difficult parts with the sourced evidence laid out, so he could see the thread himself. When she finished, he sat looking at the papers with his forearms on the table and his hands clasped, and the specific expression of a man who had just learned that a battle he thought he was winning had a second front he'd never seen. 4 years, he said. 4 years. How did he get the assessments filed against my parcel? Someone in the district billing office, she said. The assessment form requires a parcel reference and a certification that the parcel draws from the specified resource. Someone filled that form out with your parcel reference and signed the certification without verifying the draw. She paused. It may have been an error. It may not have been. Victor Doyle, Ward said flatly. Or someone he paid, she said. Either way, the mechanism is in the records and it's been accruing. He looked at her. Can you contest it? I can build the contestation, she said. I need to document that the spread never drew from the shared diversion, water usage records, any maintenance logs for the private creek access testimony from you and Hank about the water sources you've actually used. She paused. And I need to get to the county clerk before Doyle knows I've found this, because if he knows I've found it, he'll accelerate. He has enough in the record right now to argue the lien is valid, and if he pushes it to a formal proceeding before I have the contestation ready, the timeline works in his favor. How long do you need? She looked at what she had. The methodology was clear. The evidence chain was clear. The documentation she'd need was specific and finite. 5 days, she said. If you can give me everything on the water source usage going back as far as you have records. I have ledgers going back to when I bought the spread, Ward said. 11 years. Then I need those ledgers tomorrow morning, she said. All of them. He nodded once. He looked at the documents again, at the 4 years of accumulated assessments, at the mechanism that had been quietly waiting in the county records while he'd been working his land and treating his cattle and fighting what he'd thought was the real fight. May, he said. She was already gathering her notes. I know, she said. You should sleep. I need another 2 hours and then I will too. That's not what I was going to say. She stopped, looked at him. He was sitting at his table with the lamp between them and his hands still clasped, and his face, with that particular quality it got in the moments when he'd decided to say something real. I was going to say, he said carefully, that I'm glad you were standing in that yard at Callows Creek. The lamp held steady. The documents were spread between them on the table, 4 years of someone else's calculation met by 10 days of hers. She held his gaze for a moment and she said, so am I. And she meant it in more ways than she was prepared to count at 12:30 in the morning. So she went back to work and he got up and put a fresh log on the fire without being asked. and they stayed there together in the working quiet of the Dunn Creek spread. And outside, the October night had gone hard and cold, and the stars burned above the land. They were both in their different ways, fighting to keep. She had the contestation draft ready in 4 days. On the morning of the 5th day, Martha Boone came with her hand and her roan mare and sat at the table and read every page without speaking. And when she was done, she looked at May with the expression she'd worn the first morning, the assessment expression. But the result of the assessment had changed. "This is the clearest land contestation I've seen put together without a lawyer," Martha said. "I've seen lawyers do it worse," May said. "You need to get this to the clerk before Doyle does," Martha said. "He rides to town Thursdays. Today is Wednesday." "I know," May said. "I'm leaving this morning." She looked at Ward, who was standing in the doorway. "I'll drive you," he said. "I can manage." "I'll drive you," he said again, with the same tone he'd used at the placement yard, the tone of a man who had made a decision and was done reconsidering it. Martha looked between them, with the expression of a woman who found the entire situation completely legible and was choosing not to comment, which May appreciated. They left within the hour. The road to the county seat was 28 miles, and Ward drove it with the focus of a man who understood urgency without needing it performed for him. May sat with the contestation documents in her satchel, her hand resting on the flap, going through the argument in her head, the way she'd gone through it 4 times already, looking for the crack she might have missed. There wasn't one. She'd been thorough. She'd been thorough in the way she was thorough with everything that mattered, which was to say, completely and without comfort, seeking shortcuts. "You're going through it again," Ward said. "I'm checking," she said. "How many times?" "This is the 5th. "Find anything new the last 4 times?" "No." "Then stop," he said, not unkindly. "You've done the work. Let the work do what it's supposed to." She looked at him. He was watching the road with the steady attention he gave everything. That's surprisingly philosophical for a man driving a supply wagon. Something crossed his face, the ghost of that not-quite smile. "I have a philosophical side," he said. "It mostly comes out when someone else is worrying too much." She stopped going through the argument in her head. She looked at the road instead, at the dry country moving past, and she let the work sit in her satchel and be what it was. The county clerk's office was on the main street of Harrow Junction, a brick building with a wooden sign and 2 steps up that May took without difficulty, her knee holding steady in the thin midday warmth. The clerk was a woman of about 50, with the efficient manner of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by what people brought through her door. She took May's contestation package, looked at the cover notation, looked at the assessment account number, looked at May. "You're contesting 4 years of water district assessments," she said, "on the grounds that the parcel specified does not draw from the shared diversion referenced in the assessments," May said. "The documentation is complete. I've included usage record source logs and a surveyor's confirmation of the private water sources used by the parcel." The clerk read the cover page with the focused speed of a professional. "This is well organized," she said. "Thank you," May said. "The contesting party typically needs to appear in person for the preliminary review," the clerk said. "Is Mr. Ward?" "I'm here," Ward said from behind May's shoulder. He'd come up the steps quietly. He had a way of being present without announcing himself that May had stopped finding surprising 3 days in. The clerk looked at him, then back at the documents. "I'll need to log this today and schedule a review with the district assessor. Given the amount in question and the duration, it'll go to a formal hearing." She looked at May. "Whoever prepared this should plan to attend." "I'll attend," May said. The clerk looked at her steadily. "Are you the legal representative for the parcel?" "I'm the records manager for the Dunn Creek spread," May said. "And I'll attend." A pause. The clerk made a notation in her ledger. She stamped the filing date on the cover page. She slid the stamp across the counter so May could see it, today's date-time official seal. "It's in," the clerk said. May looked at the stamped cover page. 4 years of Doyle's mechanism, 10 days of her work, and the date stamp sitting over both of them like a period at the end of the sentence he'd spent 4 years writing. She picked up her copy of the filing. Behind her she heard Ward exhale, not dramatically, not with performance, but the long, slow exhale of a man who had been holding something in his chest since she'd knocked on his door at 12:30 in the morning and shown him the second front of the war he'd been fighting without knowing it. She turned. He was standing in the clerk's office with his hat in his hands, and his face with the open, unguarded quality it got when he wasn't managing it. "It's done," she said. "Yeah," he said. "It is." They stood there, and outside the clerk's office, the main street of Harrow Junction went about its ordinary business, and inside the date stamp was on the page, and neither of them said anything else, because everything that needed to be said about the last 10 days was already in the record, in the documents, in the work they'd done together, and it didn't need more words than that. Not yet. But May Harper, standing in a county clerk's office with her satchel over her shoulder and the stamped filing in her hand, allowed herself for the first time in 11 days, no longer than 11 days, longer than the placement yard and the boarding house and the lien she hadn't known about and the spread she'd lost. She allowed herself to believe that she was at last somewhere she was meant to be. She didn't say it. She didn't need to. The date stamp said it for her. The hearing was scheduled for 11 days out. May knew 11 days was enough time for Doyle to move if he was going to move, and she knew he was going to move because men like Doyle did not absorb 2 reversals and a formal contestation filing without responding. He would find the hearing date on the county calendar. It was public record available to anyone who walked through the clerk's door, and he would use whatever time he had to build a counter-argument substantial enough to bury hers. She spent the drive back from Harrow Junction thinking about what that counter-argument would look like. Ward drove and let her think, which she had come to understand was one of his specific competencies, knowing when silence was the most useful thing he could offer. She'd met few enough people in her life who had that particular skill that she'd stopped taking it for granted. "He's going to challenge the usage records," she said when they were about halfway back. Ward didn't ask who she meant. Why? Because the assessments are formally filed and formally dated, and the burden shifts to us to prove non-use, she said. "What I've submitted shows our water sources and our draw patterns, but it doesn't contain a single document from the water district itself confirming the shared diversion never serviced this parcel. If Doyle can find anyone in the district office willing to testify that the billing was correct even if it wasn't, it creates a he-said situation in the hearing room." She watched the road. A tie in a contestation hearing defaults to the existing filing, which means Doyle. Ward was quiet for a moment. "How do we get the district's own records?" "That's the question," she said. The district's internal service logs would show which parcels were connected to the diversion system and when. If the Dunn Creek spread is not in those logs, and it can't be because you've never drawn from it, then the assessment was filed in error or by fraud, and the district's own records prove it. "Can you get those logs?" "I don't know," she said. "They're internal district records, not public filings. I'd need the district administrator to cooperate, or I'd need Briggs to request them as part of his official capacity." She paused. "Or I'd need to find someone inside the district office who already knows the billing is wrong and is uncomfortable enough about it to say so." Ward thought about that. "There's a man named Aldous Crane," he said slowly. "He's worked the district billing office for 15 years. He did my original water assessment when I bought the spread. He's a fair man. I've always believed he was a fair man." "Is he still there?" "Was last I heard. Martha would know." "We need to talk to Martha tonight," May said. They talked to Martha that evening, and Martha confirmed that Aldous Crane was still in the district billing office, and that he was in her assessment, a man of particular conscientiousness, who had complained 2 years ago at a community meeting that the district's billing records had become muddled under new administrative oversight. Martha said the word muddled with the precision of a woman quoting exactly, and May felt the thing that happened in her chest when a piece clicked into a space she'd been staring at for a while. Muddled. Administrative oversight. 2 years ago. Doyle's assessment filings had started 4 years ago. 2 years and something in the billing office had changed enough that a long-term employee called it muddled at a public meeting. Crane said this publicly, May said. At the Water District annual meeting, Martha said. September 2 years back, I was there. He said the new intake process for parcel assessments had introduced inconsistencies that needed to be reviewed. She looked at May. Nobody followed up on it that I know of. Doyle's client acquired the district assessment contract 2 years ago, May said. She knew this because she'd read the district charter documents every page, and the administrative appointment was in the back of the charter amendment filed in the fall 2 years ago, listed without particular emphasis among 17 other amendments. That's when the intake process changed. The kitchen was very quiet. Ward said, he put someone in the district office. Or he used the contract to change the process enough that false assessments could be filed without the existing staff catching them. May said. Crane may not have known specifics. He may have only known something was wrong. She looked at Martha. I need to talk to him. Martha looked at Ward. Ward looked at May. I'll take you Thursday, Ward said. That's only 8 days before the hearing, May said. If Crane is cooperative and has the service logs, I can build the supplemental filing in time. If he's not, she stopped. If he's not, we work with what we have, Ward said. It was the tone of a man who had made a decision before the alternatives finished presenting themselves, and May recognized it as one of his most consistent qualities, the ability to commit without certainty, which was the only way anything real ever got done. She nodded. Thursday, she said. She spent the 2 days before Thursday going back through the district charter, the billing amendments. Every public document that touched the period when the new intake process had been implemented, building the timeline with the specificity of someone who was going to have to defend it in a hearing room with an official record running and an opposing party looking for seams. Hank came to find her on Wednesday evening walking without the shuffle. He'd had a week ago his color returned, his eyes clear. He sat across the table from her and watched her work for a few minutes without speaking. You're going after the whole thing, he said. Not just the water. The water is the whole thing, she said. The boundary claims, the spring classification, the assessment, they're all parts of the same mechanism. Doyle is working for someone who wants this land specifically because of its water access, and he's been building toward a legal position that makes acquisition inevitable. She looked up. If I only win the assessment hearing, the boundary filings are still in the record, and he tries again from that angle. If I only clear the boundary records, the assessment accrues for 10 more months and becomes a lien. She paused. I need to dismantle the whole thing at once. Hank was quiet for a moment. That's a lot to hold. I know, she said. He looked at her with his clear gray eyes. How are you holding up? The question surprised her. Not the fact of it. Hank asked direct questions, she'd learned that, but the timing, the specific gentleness of it. She set her pen down. I'm all right, she said. You sleeping? Some. May. He said her name the way people said names when they wanted to move past the surface of the answer that had just been given. She looked at him. I know what it feels like when someone is about to lose something they built, she said. I've felt it myself, and I know what it feels like to be the person who could have stopped it and didn't, and I am not going to feel that again. Her voice was level. So I sleep enough to function, and I work the rest, and I'll sleep properly when this is finished. Hank looked at her for a long moment. Caleb know how much you're carrying right now. Caleb is working his spread, she said. He's got cattle and fence and a spring line and a herd to watch. May, he said again. She picked up her pen. I'm fine, Hank. He stood up. He put his hand on the table near her stack of documents, not touching them, just present. You saved my life, he said plainly and without ceremony. I ain't the kind of man who forgets that. And I'm telling you that Caleb Ward has not slept easy since you started losing sleep. In case you wanted to know. He walked out, and May sat at the table, and the lamp burned, and she let herself sit with what he'd said for exactly 1 minute before she went back to work, because she had a hearing in 8 days, and a Thursday meeting with a district billing clerk, and a case to build that was going to have to be airtight. But she let herself have the minute. She was learning slowly to let herself have the minute. Aldous Crane met them in a small office behind the main billing counter, a man of about 60, with careful hands and the specific manner of someone who had spent decades doing work he believed in and had recently found that belief complicated. He recognized Ward immediately and shook his hand with the warmth of a long acquaintance. He looked at May with curiosity and without the dismissal she'd grown accustomed to, which told her something about the kind of man he was. Ward said, "This is May Harper. She manages records for my spread. She's found something in the district billing files that I think you need to see." Crane looked at May. "All right," he said. She laid it out cleanly. The assessment history. The parcel referenced the documentation she'd filed, contesting it the timeline that connected the implementation of the new intake process with the first fraudulent assessment. She didn't editorialize. She let the documents speak with the specificity she'd built into them. Crane listened with his hands flat on the desk and his face going through several quiet changes that she watched carefully. Recognition, discomfort, something sharper that she identified as anger, arriving from a long distance and moving fast. When she finished, he said, "Who filed the original assessment?" "The intake form was submitted under the new administrative process," she said. "I don't have the name of the individual who completed it. I suspect you might." He looked at the assessment form she'd placed in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. "The new intake process," he said carefully, "was implemented by the district administrator appointed under the oversight contract awarded 2 years ago." He stopped. "I raised a concern at the annual meeting." "I know," May said. "Martha Boone heard you." He looked up. Something moved through his face, the specific expression of a man who had been uncomfortable about something for 2 years and had just been handed both the vocabulary to name it and a reason to act on it that was larger than his discomfort. "The service connection logs," he said. "The internal records showing which parcels are physically connected to the shared diversion system." He paused. "The Dunn Creek spread is not in those logs. It has never been. I know because I did the original assessment when Mr. Ward purchased the property, and the diversion connection did not exist and was never built." May kept her voice steady. "Would you be willing to provide a certified copy of the service connection log for this parcel and to appear at the contestation hearing to confirm its accuracy?" Crane looked at Ward. Ward looked back at him without speaking, which was, May had come to understand its own kind of statement. "Yes," Crane said. "I would." He pulled the service connection ledger from a cabinet behind him. He opened it. He found the Dunn Creek spread entry, a single line dated 11 years ago, noting the initial assessment and the absence of diversion connection, the assessment marked as private source, only the clerk's signature at the bottom. His own signature. He looked at that signature for a moment. Then he looked at the fraudulent assessment filed 4 years ago under a process he hadn't designed and had tried once and insufficiently to flag as wrong. "I should have pushed harder," he said quietly. "You're pushing now," May said. "That's what matters." He looked at her, and in his face was the expression she'd seen before on Briggs on the bank representative who had handed the documents back, the expression of a person who had just recognized what they were dealing with and had decided which side of the line they intended to stand on. "I'll have the certified copy ready by tomorrow morning," he said. Ned. She had the certified copy in hand by 9 the next morning, and she spent Friday and Saturday building the supplemental filing with the methodical speed of someone who had been moving toward this exact document since the first moment she'd seen the false assessment number in the billing records. It was, she believed, the strongest single piece of legal documentation she had ever assembled. Not because she was the one who'd assembled it. She was clear-eyed enough to separate her feelings about a thing from her assessment of its quality, but because the evidence was simply that clean. Crane's service log, Briggs's resurvey record, the annotated comparison of the fraudulent reference number, the timeline connecting the administrative contract to the first false filing. Martha Boone's written account of Doyle's attempt on the North spread. Taken together, they didn't just contest the assessment. they told the story of a coordinated scheme. She filed the supplemental Monday morning, and the clerk looked at the new package with the same professional composure she'd shown the first filing, and stamped it in, and May watched the date go on the page, and felt something settle in her that had been moving since the first morning in Callows Creek. 5 days before the hearing, Victor Doyle made his last move. She didn't know it was his last move at the time. She thought it was the beginning of something new, which was why the knock on the main house door at 7 in the evening hit her the way it did. Sharp and cold, the knock of someone who had decided that the ordinary channels weren't moving fast enough. She opened the door. The man on the porch was not Doyle, and was not the man she'd seen before. He was older, well-dressed in a way that was several degrees more expensive than Doyle's careful suit, and he had the settled authority of a man who didn't send other people to do things when he was in a position to do them himself. "Miss Harper," he said, "my name is Gerald Ashworth. I represent the Western Basin Land Company." He paused. "May I come in?" She stepped back from the door. He came in and sat at the table without being invited, which told her something different than it had told her about Martha. This was not the ease of a friend, but the assumption of a man who occupied rooms without waiting to be welcomed into them. Ward came in from the back of the house with a coffee cup in his hand and stopped when he saw Ashworth. Ashworth looked at him, then back at May, and she saw in that sequence the recognition of where the authority in this room actually sat. "I'll be direct," Ashworth said. "The Western Basin Land Company has a legitimate interest in the water access of the Dunn Creek spread as part of a broader regional water management strategy. We've been pursuing that interest through proper channels." He let that sit for a moment. "I understand there's a contestation hearing in 5 days." "There is," May said. "I'd like to propose a resolution before the hearing takes place," Ashworth said. "The company is prepared to offer Mr. Ward a purchase price of $12,000 for the eastern parcel and the creek access rights. He would retain the main house, the outbuildings, the western range, and the spring." $12,000. May heard Ward go still behind her. "The proposal," she said, keeping her voice level, "is contingent on withdrawal of the contestation filing." "The proposal makes the contestation moot," Ashworth said. "If Mr. Ward accepts the offer, there's nothing to contest." "And if he doesn't accept," she said. "The company proceeds to the hearing with whatever counter-argument your people have been building for the last 3 weeks." Ashworth looked at her. He had the eyes of a man who was good at reading situations, and had been doing it for a long time, and she watched him read this one, and arrive at the correct conclusion, which was that she had already made the same calculation he was making. "Miss Harper," he said, and his voice was different now, not softer, but more level, the voice of a man choosing to operate without pretense. "I know what you've filed. I know what Crane is prepared to testify to. I know what the resurvey shows." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here because we think we're going to win the hearing. I'm here because going to the hearing costs both parties money and time and makes everything that Doyle has done a matter of public record." He let the implication sit. "We would prefer a quiet resolution. That's what the 12,000 represents." The room was very quiet. May looked at the man across the table. She looked at his expensive coat and his settled authority, and the $12,000 that he'd laid down like a card he believed was going to end the hand. She said, "The answer is no." Ashworth didn't move. "Miss Harper." "The answer is no," she said again, and she turned to Ward. She looked at him clearly and without performance. "Unless you want to accept it, it's your land, it's your decision." Ward looked at Ashworth. His face had the quality it got when he'd already made the decision and was simply locating the words. "I built this spread from nothing," he said. "I dug the well and set the fence posts and ran the cattle through 4 dry summers. I'm not selling the creek that runs through it because a land company sent a man in an expensive suit to make it sound reasonable." He set his coffee cup down. "No." Ashworth looked at Ward, then at May, then at the table. "The hearing will be a public record," he said. "I know," May said. "Everything we've filed will be in that record. Crane's testimony will be in that record. The fraudulent reference number, the fabricated boundary adjustments, the administrative contract that enabled the false assessments, all of it will be in that record. She held his gaze. You said you'd prefer a quiet resolution. I understand that. We won't be providing one. He stood. He straightened his coat. He looked at May for a long moment with the expression of a man revising a significant assessment. You're very good at this, he said. It was not flattery. It was the specific acknowledgement of a professional who had encountered a capability they hadn't anticipated. I know, she said. He left. Ward closed the door behind him and stood with his hand on the latch for a moment, and then he turned and looked at May. That's the man behind Doyle, he said. That's the man behind Doyle, she confirmed. And he just told us they don't think they can win the hearing, which means our filing is as strong as I believed it was. She felt the case clicking into its final shape, not triumph yet, because the hearing hadn't happened, and she didn't traffic in victory until it was real, but the particular clarity of a mechanism working the way it was designed to work. 5 days, Ward said. 5 days, she said. I need to prepare your testimony. You'll need to speak at the hearing to the water usage, to the creek, access to the history of the spring. It needs to come from you directly. Tell me what to say. I'll tell you what to cover, she said. What you say needs to be yours. If it sounds prepared, it sounds weak. If it sounds like the truth spoken by a man who knows it, it sounds like what it is. She looked at him steadily. It is the truth. That's the advantage we have that they don't. He looked at her with that face she'd cataloged, the one that moved in ways that mattered. May, he said. I know, she said. Let me get my notes. That's not... He stopped. He looked at his hands, then back at her. You've been fighting this thing since the first day you got here, before you knew what you were walking into, before you had any reason to. I had every reason, she said. This is my work. This is what I do. That's not why you stayed up until 2 a.m. for 11 nights running, he said. That's not why you walked the creek line before breakfast. That's not why you went to Crane. She held his gaze. Outside the kitchen window, the October dark was complete, and the fire in the stove was warm, and the Dunn Creek spread was quiet around them. No, she said. That's not why. The word sat between them clear and unambiguous, and Ward looked at her with the expression she had never quite finished cataloging, because every time she tried to name it, he'd put it away before she could. But this time, he didn't put it away. He said, after the hearing. Yes, she said, after the hearing. It was not a promise, technically. It was a coordinate, a point they'd agreed to navigate toward, past the work that still needed doing. Past the 5 days that stood between them and the moment when the most pressing thing would no longer be a legal case. She got her notes. They sat at the table, and she walked him through his testimony question by question, and he answered in the plain, specific way of a man who had lived the truth he was being asked to describe, and she listened and shaped and refined, and the fire burned down, and neither of them hurried. There was still a hearing to win. But there was also now something on the other side of it that was worth winning it for, and that made all the difference in the world. The hearing room in Harrow Junction held 22 people and smelled like wood oil and old paper, and the particular tension of a room where people had come expecting a fight. May counted the attendees before she sat down, because counting was how she settled herself when the thing she'd been building toward finally arrived, and the work shifted from preparation to execution. She counted, and she cataloged 6 people she recognized as water district officials or county clerks. 3 she identified as Ashworth's people by the quality of their coats and the way they positioned themselves near the door. Martha Boone in the second row, with her hands folded and her face set in the expression of a woman who had already decided how this was going to end and was here to watch it arrive. Hank Riley beside her, still a little thin from the illness, but upright and present, and wearing his good shirt. Aldous Crane sat in the witness area with the service connection ledger on his knees, and the expression of a man who had been waiting 2 years for the right moment to do a thing he should have done sooner and had found it. Doyle was not there. May noted his absence and filed it without surprise. Men who operated through mechanism and distance rarely appeared for the accounting. Ashworth was there. He sat in the back row with two men on either side and watched her the way professionals watched each other, with attention, without drama. Ward sat beside May at the presenting table. He'd worn his best jacket, the dark canvas one with the clean collar, and he sat the way he sat on the wagon seat, straight and settled, without the particular tension of a man who feared what was coming. He'd practiced his testimony for 3 evenings. She'd drilled him harder on the second night than the first, and harder on the third than the second, because the opposing party's counter-argument had become clear to her by Wednesday, and she'd needed him prepared for the specific questions they would ask. The hearing officer was a woman named Priscilla Holt, a county appointee in her 50s, with the kind of face that had stopped performing patients a long time ago and simply had it. She called the room to order without raising her voice, and the room came to order and the hearing began. May presented first. She had organized the case into 3 clear sections: the service connection record, establishing; non-use the timeline, establishing the fraudulent filing origin, and the documentation of the broader scheme connecting the administrative contract to the false assessments. And she moved through them with the pacing of someone who had thought about this argument so many times that it had stopped feeling like argument and started feeling like narration. This is what happened. This is the record. This is what it means. When she finished, the room was quiet in the way it got when something had been said that everyone present understood was significant. Holt looked at her over the table. The supplemental filing includes a certified service log from the district billing office, she said. Is the clerk who certified that log present? Yes, May said. Aldous Crane, district billing clerk, 15 years of service. Crane was called. He took his position. He answered Holt's questions in the direct, specific manner of a man who had decided to tell the truth completely and was not going to be moved from that position. He identified the service log. He confirmed the Dunn Creek spread had never been connected to the shared diversion system. He confirmed his own signature on the original assessment dated 11 years ago, noting private source only. Then he said, without being asked, I raised a concern at the annual district meeting 2 years ago about the accuracy of the new intake process for parcel assessments. I should have done more. I didn't. I am doing it now. The room absorbed this. Ashworth's 2 men looked at each other. Ashworth looked at May. She looked back at him and kept her face neutral because the hearing wasn't finished, and she'd learned a long time ago not to spend anything before the work was done. The opposing party's representative, a lawyer from Harrow Junction named Croft, who had the tightly wound energy of a man working with instructions he'd received too late to use, effectively presented the counter-argument. He challenged the supplemental filing on procedural grounds, which Holt dismissed in under 2 minutes. He argued the assessment had been applied in good faith, under the new intake process, which Crane's testimony had already removed the foundation from. He attempted to argue that the service connection log predated the relevant assessment period and was therefore not probative, and May objected on the grounds that the log was a continuous record updated through the current year, and Holt sustained the objection without deliberating. Croft tried one more angle. The contesting party, he said, and he was looking at Ward but angling his voice toward Holt, is represented by a placement worker with no formal legal standing in this proceeding. The filing itself and the supplemental documentation were prepared by a person who is not a licensed surveyor, not a licensed attorney, and not an officer of the court. The room felt it shift. May kept her hands flat on the table. Holt looked at Croft. The filing is in order under the contestation rules applicable to this district, she said. Those rules do not require legal representation. They require documentation. The documentation provided meets the standard. She looked at Croft the way a woman looked at something she'd been asked to examine and found less substantial than advertised. Do you have additional evidentiary argument, Mr. Croft? Or have you concluded? Croft had concluded. Ward was called. He stood. He spoke the way May had taught him to speak, plainly, specifically, in the clear voice of a man describing his own life on his own land. He described every water source the spread had used in 11 years. He described the creek access, the private well, the barrel system, the spring line. He described Hank Riley's illness and the contaminated water and the barrel system extension he and May had dug together by hand. He described the moment he'd understood that Doyle had been filing against his property for 4 years without his knowledge. He did not perform anger. He did not perform injury. He simply described what had happened, and the weight of it was in the facts themselves, and the room felt that weight without being told to. When he sat back down, May heard Martha Boone make a sound in the second row that was not quite words, but had the character of vindication. Holt deliberated for 8 minutes. May counted them. When Holt came back to the table, she looked at her notes, then at the room. "The contestation is upheld," she said. "The assessment filings against parcel number 14-7-C under account reference DK-1882 are invalid, fraudulently applied, and are hereby removed from the district record in their entirety. No lien has been established against the Dunn Creek spread under these filings, and none shall be recognized." She looked at the opposing table. "I am referring the matter of the intake process irregularities to the county administrator's office for review. That review will include examination of all parcel assessments filed under the current intake process during the period in question." She closed her ledger. "This hearing is concluded." For a moment the room held itself in the particular suspension that followed decisive things, the way air held itself after a door shut in a closed space, and then it released, and Hank made a sound that was entirely words and entirely unprintable. And Martha laughed once, short and full-throated, and Ward turned to May. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her a dozen times in the past 3 weeks. The recalibrating look, the category adjustment look, but this time there was nothing left to adjust. The category was simply what it was. She was what she was, and he knew it completely. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. She let herself feel it. She had promised herself she wouldn't until it was real, and now it was real, and she let it move through her. Not triumph, nothing so loud as that. But the deep and quiet satisfaction of work, completed at the standard, she held herself to, and the knowledge that the land was safe, and the man beside her would not wake tomorrow under the threat that had been building toward him for 4 years without his knowing. Ashworth left without speaking to either of them. His 2 men followed. Croft gathered his papers with the efficiency of a man who had already moved on to his next case. Crane shook Ward's hand, and then May's, and he held hers for a moment and said, "I'm glad you found it." And she said, "I'm glad you kept the log." And they both knew that what they were really saying was that a thing had been broken and had been fixed, and they had each been necessary to the fixing, and that was enough. The road back to the Dunn Creek spread was the same 28 miles it had always been, but something in the quality of the silence on it was different, and May thought it was probably because the last 3 weeks had been lived at a particular pitch of urgency and focus that had left no space for anything else, and now the space had opened. Ward drove. She sat beside him. The gray gelding moved at its steady pace. After about 10 minutes, Ward said, "I've been thinking about the spring line." She looked at him. "What about it?" "It could serve the north pasture through summer if we extended it another 80 yards, he said. "Would need a second connection point and a gravity flow adjustment, but the grade is workable." She considered this. "You'd need a second crew for the digging." "I'd have Hank. He'll be back to full strength in another week." He paused. "And you, if you're still here." She looked at the road ahead. "My placement arrangement ends in 3 days." "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to speak with you about that." She waited. "The spread needs a records manager," he said in the particular voice he used when he was constructing a practical case for something he had already decided to want. "Someone who can maintain the deed records, manage the water district filings going forward, track the county clerk's review of the assessment process. There's a real job here. It's not a placement. It's a permanent position." "A permanent position," she said. "With appropriate arrangements," he said. "The main house has a second room that hasn't been used since—" He stopped. "It hasn't been used. It could be." She looked at him. He was watching the road with the focused attention of a man who was being extremely careful about something. "Caleb," she said. He turned his head. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both knew it, and it sat between them with the weight of a small and significant event. "You're not offering me a records position," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "No," he said. "I'm not." "Then say what you're actually offering." He was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "I'm asking you to stay. Not as a placement, not as a hire. I'm asking you to stay because this spread is better with you on it, and I am better with you on it, and I have known both those things since the first day, and I have been trying to find the right time to say them. And Hank told me last week there is no right time, and I should just say them, and Hank is usually right about things, which is why I've kept him for 11 years. May looked at the road. She felt something move through her that was warm and clear, and not at all frightening, which surprised her, because she'd expected fear. She'd had enough go wrong that she'd expected her own instincts to flinch at the thing she actually wanted. They didn't flinch. They recognized it. That was the difference between the woman she'd been 3 years ago and the woman she was now. She could recognize the right thing when it appeared in front of her, and she didn't need to talk herself into believing it. "Hank told me something similar," she said, "about how you ask." Ward made a sound. "What did he say?" "That you'd find a practical reason," she said, "and call that the question." He was quiet for a moment. "He knows me too well." "He does," she said. "So does Martha, I think." "Martha has opinions about everything," Ward said. "She's right about most of them, which makes it worse." He paused. "May." "Yes," she said. He turned his head. "Yes," she said again clearly without qualification. "I'll stay." He looked at her with the open, unguarded quality she'd catalogued since the first week. The face underneath the controlled face, the face that didn't know how to be anything other than exactly what it was. "All right," he said. The words were simple, and the voice behind them was not. He turned back to the road. She turned back to the road. The gelding moved steadily north through the country she had walked and measured and fought for, and the silence between them was the particular silence of people who had found the thing they were looking for, and were now simply in the presence of it, which required no words and no performance, and nothing at all except being there. 3 days later, the agency clerk from Callows Creek arrived to close out the placement arrangement. He was the same young man with the ink-stained fingers, and he had the same ledger, and he stood in the yard of the Dunn Creek spread and looked at May with the expression of someone encountering a situation that didn't match his paperwork. "Miss Harper," he said, "I have you listed as completing placement on Saturday." "I'm completing placement on Saturday," she said. "I'm beginning a permanent position with the Dunn Creek spread on Sunday." He blinked. "A permanent that would need to be. There's a reclassification form." "I have it," she said. She handed him the form which she'd obtained from the county employment registry in Harrow Junction and completed the previous evening. "The position is records manager and property administrator. The compensation is listed on page 2. He took the form with both hands and read it with the expression of a man who had expected a 10-minute administrative closure and had received a comprehensive package instead. "This is very thorough," he said. "Thank you," she said. He looked up. "The agency noted a concern about your knee," he said, "and this time it wasn't a weapon, and it wasn't a cruelty, just the reflexive repetition of a thing that was in his file." And May looked at him with more patience than she'd had for him 3 weeks ago at the placement yard. Because 3 weeks ago she'd been terrified, and now she was not, and the difference made generosity easier. "My knee locks in cold weather," she said. "I manage it. It has not prevented me from completing any work to date." She paused. "Including building a water line, conducting a land survey, documenting a 4-year fraud scheme, and presenting a successful contestation at a county hearing." She looked at him steadily. "You can update the file." He wrote something in his ledger. She couldn't see what it said, but he wrote it with the energy of a man recording something he intended to remember. He signed the closure form. She signed the reclassification. He rode back down the road toward Callows Creek with his ledger under his arm, and May stood in the yard and watched him go, and felt the specific satisfaction of a chapter ending at exactly the right moment. Hank came out of the bunkhouse. "He gone?" "He's gone," she said. "Martha's coming for supper," he said. "She said she's bringing that berry pie she makes that's better than anything else in this county." "She told me," May said. "Caleb's been in the north pasture since noon," Hank said, with the particular innocence he deployed when he was not being innocent. "Said the spring line connection needed checking." "I'll go find him," she said. Hank's face arranged itself into an expression of profound satisfaction. "I'll get the fire going," he said. She walked the north pasture in the late afternoon, her knee loose in the mild warmth of what might be one of the last warm days before the first freeze settled in and stayed. The land was familiar under her feet. Now she knew its grades, its wet spots, its fence lines, the places where the soil changed texture, the angle of the spring line as it ran toward the main trough. She had walked it enough that it had stopped being new. She found Ward at the connection point, crouched beside the fitting with a wrench in his hand, and the focused quiet of a man doing work he knew well. He heard her coming and looked up. "Connection holding?" she said. "Needs the fitting tightened before the freeze," he said. "Another half turn." He made it. He stood and looked at the line running down the grade toward the trough, the water moving steady and clear through the system they'd built together. "Martha's coming for supper," May said. "I know," he said. "She told me yesterday and then again this morning to make sure I'd remembered." "Have you? I've been thinking about it all day," he said, which was not an answer to the question she'd asked, and they both knew it. She stood beside him. The north pasture was quiet. The water ran through the line. The land held them both in the particular stillness of a late October afternoon when the light was going low and gold and the work of the day was almost done. "I want to extend the line in spring," she said. "Another 80 yards east. I've been looking at the grade, and I think we can do it with 3 connection points and a simple gravity adjustment." "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "I know," she said. "You told me on the drive back from Harrow Junction. You had thoughts about it." "I have thoughts about everything," she said. "You'll need to get used to that." He looked at her. The low gold light was on his face, and he wasn't putting anything away this time. "I know," he said. "I'm looking forward to it." She looked at the land they were standing on, the land she'd read and measured and defended and fought for, and was now officially the administrator of, which was the most practical word for a thing that was not only practical, and they both understood that too. "I lost a spread once," she said. "To a lien I didn't know about. I worked it and I loved it and I lost it, and afterward I thought I would never again make the mistake of believing something was mine before it was proven mine." She paused. "I've been careful since then, maybe too careful." "Maybe," he said. "This is mine," she said. Not a question, not a performance, just the specific deliberate act of saying a true thing out loud, which was harder than it sounded and more necessary than she'd let herself admit until now. "This land, this work." She looked at him. "This." Ward looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something he'd never done in 3 weeks of proximity and shared labor and the particular closeness of people who had fought for something together. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with ceremony. The way a man took the hand of a woman he'd been standing beside for long enough that the reaching was simply the honest conclusion of what had already been true for a while. His hand was scarred and work-roughened and warm, and she held it, and neither of them said anything for a moment because the moment was complete without words. Then she said, "We're going to be late for Martha's pie." "We are," he said. They walked back toward the main house together, across the land that was safe and proven, and theirs, and the spring line ran behind them with its quiet, continuous sound, and in the main house a fire was burning, and Hank Riley was getting the table set with the methodical care of a man who had narrowly avoided dying, and had decided to be grateful for ordinary things, and Martha Boone was going to arrive with her pie and her opinions, and the first freeze was coming, but the water was secured, and the records were in order, and the land was clean. May Harper had been marked with a red X in an agency ledger in Callows Creek 23 days ago, and she had stood at the end of a line of 24 women, and felt the specific cold of being the last choice, and she had carried her satchel into a placement yard, with her knees stiffening in the October cold, and 11 days to prove she was worth keeping. She had spent those 23 days reading every document they put in front of her, and several they hadn't walking land in the dark, sitting with a sick man through his fever, digging a trench with a rancher who turned out to be the kind of man she'd stopped believing existed, building a case from scratch against a mechanism that had been running for 4 years and was designed to be invisible. She had won, but winning wasn't the right word for it. She had simply done the work completely, and at the standard she set for herself, which was the only standard she'd ever known how to operate at. And the work had given her back everything she'd stopped letting herself want. A woman dismissed at a placement yard for a bad knee and a red mark in a clerk's file had walked onto a drought-stricken spread with nothing but a satchel and a set of skills that nobody in that yard had taken the trouble to see. And she had read the water and cured the sick and found the fraud and fixed the records and saved the land. Not because anyone expected her to. Not because anyone asked her to. Because it was what she was capable of, and she had never once stopped being capable of it. And now there was a man who knew that, and a spread that was hers, and a spring line running clean and steady through the north pasture, and that was the truth that mattered. She had been left to last in that yard. She had turned out to be the one who held the line when it counted most, and she was never going to be anyone's last choice again.